Good morning, friends. Oh, well, it's morning here. Who knows when you're listening to it? Good day.
There's always that.
Yeah. Well, right away, I was joking with Dave before. Like, hey, let's go without a net and stuff. So here we are. Stuff. Yeah. So if you're not someone who's watched the series of videos Dave and I have done, this is my friend Dave Brisbin. He's also a mentor, spiritual guide. He's a husband. He's a father. He's a pastor at the Effect Church, which focuses on the second half of life, and also an author, best-selling author, actually. Well, yeah, it's not like you have fame and fortune, but Amazon gave you that badge, so I'm going to mention it. But yeah, Dave's written a lot of books, and I have to say, as much as I've appreciated Richard Rohr's writing, again, Richard Rohr is the author of the first and second half of life, or excuse me, Falling Upward, and the spirituality for the two halves of life, and a lot of other books as well. But Dave's writings are on par with any of Rohr's. Okay, not to put you too much on a pedestal, Dave, but he's got some good stuff. And if you're appreciating what's being shared here, and if you've read any of Rohr's books, I think Dave's writing will be very complimentary to it. Okay. So that being said, I'd like to talk a little bit about Dave's first book called The Fifth Way. So Dave, instead of me trying to talk about it, I might as well let the author. Can you tell our friends a little bit about what the Fifth Way is?
Sure. The subtitle to The Fifth Way is a Western journey to the Hebrew heart of Jesus, I believe is the way it read. Been a while. And so the idea was, what does it take for a modern Westerner to actually be able to sit at the feet of an ancient Eastern Jesus? And that presupposes that we even buy into the fact that Jesus was an Eastern man, a Hebrew, speaking an Eastern language to an Eastern audience. And so that the only way that we can really understand what he's trying to get across is through that lens, to be able to go back and look at him through the Aramaic language that he spoke and what it meant at that time, through that worldview, through that idea and understanding of science and culture and everything going on at the time through that lens. So that was the idea behind it, because that's what had struck me as I was actually moving into a study of Christian origins and trying to find a Jesus that made any kind of sense to me, because Christianity at that point was not, and the way it was being practiced was not. But as I dug into it, I found an Eastern Jesus who made perfect sense to me. And I realized, these are the teachings that I can actually follow for the rest of my life. And what I observed as I was looking at him in that context in first century Judaism, I became acquainted with the four philosophies of Judaism. And they were represented by four of the major sects, S-E-C-T-S, of Judaism at the time. And those were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. Every one of those four, it was so interesting, embodied a different way of dealing with the challenges that they were facing at that time in their national life, which was Roman occupation at the time, but also at the tail end of 400 years or so of occupation from one foreign power to the next, and how they were chafing under this occupation, having just had a taste of independence for about 75 years under the Hasmoneans. And I know I'm getting into the weeds here historically, but let me just sum it up by saying each one of them represented this different way of dealing with their difficulties, their obstacles, and their challenges, which represented the universal way that all of us as human beings deal with the challenges in our lives. And that was either to yield to the power or to the force, the obstacle that's in our path, or to try to influence it or manipulate it, or to try to tear it down and destroy it, or to simply exit the situation. So each one of those four had that way of dealing with the Romans and dealing with the forces in their lives. But if you break it down and just look at in a marriage, in a workplace situation, anything we do, we have 4 choices to try to deal with things that stand in our way, frustrate, or block our agendas. And that's, we can yield to it, we can try to influence or manipulate, we can exit, or we can destroy. But what I realized is that what Jesus was bringing was a completely different way, a 5th way of dealing with all of life, human life. The 4 ways deal with physical life on the surface of the planet. Jesus' way comes in from a different angle, from a heavenly angle, if you will, but a spiritual angle that takes those 4 ways and basically turns them on their head, turns everything upside down. If we want to go someplace in the spiritual life, we actually do it in the opposite way that we would acquire something or get something in the physical life. So instead of acquiring, we're relinquishing. And so if we go back to the 3 temptations in the desert of Jesus, they were basically summarizing the 3 drives that we have to overcome in our lives as human beings. And Henry Nouwen puts it kind of brilliantly. He said it's the drive to be relevant, to be powerful, and then to be spectacular. And Thomas Keating puts it, as the drive for survival and security, the drive for power and control, and the drive for affection and esteem. Those 3 drive us in terms of trying to get what we need out of life and drive those 4 ways that we're talking about. But for Jesus, if you want to find your life, you have to lose it. If you're going to sit at the head of the table, you have to sit at the foot of the table. And if you want to be a leader, then you need to be a servant. If you want to find relevance in your life, you need to give relevance away. If you want power, you basically empower others. And if you want to be spectacular and you want to be esteemed, then you give attention away to others. And it's exactly the opposite. And it was just so fascinating to me that this 5th way, that is the only way to what he calls kingdom, the only way to this undivided presence, is exactly opposite and upside down to everything that we are trying to do as human beings in this life. And if you think about it, this is the exact same description of the first and second halves of life. The first half of life is working along the first 4 ways and trying to use relevance and power and spectacular attention to achieve our goals. And then the second half of life is relinquishing all that, giving it all away and finding identity in a completely different place. But the 2 jive really well. And what Jesus is describing to us is a way to the second half of life. And the only way to the undivided presence in all our moments that he calls kingdom, which is that quality of life that we can have when we are undividedly present. So how's that for tying it all together?
You did that very well. Thank you, Dave.
All right.
Certainly better than I would. Yeah. But yeah, one of the reasons why I enjoyed this book, when I was in seminary at the time and I was all kind of geeking out how all the sex, operated and such. But yeah, I certainly very much identify more with the zealots and the Essenes. The escapism, this is too hard. I don't want to deal with it. But also the whole, I don't know, if you're going to offend me, I'm going to come back at you at double force, and certainly I see that as a commonality in the first half of life. I certainly wasn't there. But yeah, then as I've moved on in life, understanding this whole compliance thing, this conforming, it's very much how I would create a persona to be liked. My codependency, the nature of that is, to get what I wanted, I'll play the role that makes you like me. Because again, ultimately what I wanted to do was be approved of, yeah. And then there's certainly elements of trying to control and manipulate people as well too. So all these things I could recognize in my life. But, this, again, I was reading this book, I don't know, 10 some years ago. And now, yes, as I've moved on with this contemplative life, this being present and such that we'll get into in a minute, it's not just recognizing that this is the programming that I've had to find, I don't know, what I'm looking for in life. And maybe, kind of finding the eye of the storm as there's chaos and confusion and just life going on around me and such, trying to find a little bit of safety. What really is about this is, what you touched on here is everything that once served me no longer is working. Much like when I stopped drinking. And again, things weren't working for me for a long time, but because I knew nothing else, this had proven itself well enough and was still providing a little bit of peace in the middle of the storm. I kept it up, and eventually, it just really, there was no other solution than surrendering, which again, letting go, giving it over to God is what we talk about in recovery worlds and stuff like that. But in general, it's just in life in general, it's like we just get to the point where we realize this just is not working. And even though I had no idea of what you just spoke about and such, I knew what I didn't want anymore. And again, it's just really been a series of surrenders, even still to this day, because moments come up, even though there's been a lot of progress and life is better than it's ever been before, there's reminders in life that there's more work to be done, more inner work, which is, again, kind of contrary out. His work is actually, again, being still and letting go and not trying to have all the answers.
Mm-hmm.
And what I want to get and kind of segue into that's kind of the simplest way if I was talking with someone around the picnic table about what contemplative life, what being present in the moment is. And this is something that, again, really, there's a lot of authors that are getting into this. Eckhart Tolle, am I pronouncing his name correctly and stuff? The Power of Now and such, that seems to be his, I don't know, flag in the on the top of the hill. That's what he's known for and such. But he certainly didn't invent it. Again, Jesus seemed to be the one who really brought it forth to the world and such. But even Jesus, I don't think really was the guy who invented it. He just really kind of perfected it and made it in a way where he could demonstrate this fifth way. Am I correct, Dave?
Yeah, yes. And I think it's really important also to point out that it's not that the four ways are bad and the fifth way is good, or even that the fifth way replaces the four ways. And it's the same thing with the first and second halves. It's not that the first half is bad and the second half is good, or the second half replaces the first. It's that the second half and the fifth way comes in and balances out the four ways and the first half of life. We need a balance of both. As long as we're drawing breath, we're going to need those four ways that kind of correspond to the 4 points of the compass, a 360-degree view of life. Because as we're moving and working and growing our families and preserving our families and just doing anything we do, we're going to sometimes need to yield to the powers that be. If we're going to want a paycheck, then we're going to have to yield and submit to the rules of the employer. But there are times when things are wrong and we need to try to influence them. Manipulation has a sort of a negative context, but at least to influence and to try to change things from within, the way the Pharisees did, that is something that it is a moral responsibility for us to try to do. Of course, at times. There are going to be times when we need to stand up and fight, not to destroy the opposition, but to at least protect those who can't protect themselves. And then there are times that we just need to leave, whether it's a job, a marriage, or a point of view. It's time to go. And so those are our four ways of dealing. And of course, there's everything in between, because there's going to be nuances. There's southeast and northwest and so on and so forth. But we need those. We absolutely need those. But if we don't, at a certain point in life, start to balance those out with the reality that ultimate meaning and purpose is not going to come from out there. It's not going to come from the physical accomplishments and the material possessions that we accrue. It's going to come from the inside out. It's going to come from a deeper source. And eventually all those are going to lose their luster, even as we need to continue to maintain them in physical life. But to then add the fifth way, to realize it's by giving back, it's by relinquishing, it's by the focus on others and a servant leadership model, that we really start to find the true meaning and purpose and sense of identity in life, which then reinflates, restores meaning and purpose to the physical work that we're doing. Because there's a task within the task that we start to recognize, that constant connection that is happening as we do whatever we do, and that undivided presence that we start to create moment to moment, that incorporates those and unifies them and draws them together. So that's just an important thing to remember, that these work hand in glove together. They don't supersede. One is not bad and one is not good, but we need them all together. And typically early in life, it's very difficult for us to be able to pull in that fifth way, to pull in that second half mentality until we get to a certain age and we have enough panorama in the rear view mirror to be able to see how life is really working.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that pulled you away from your original question. So if I did go off on a tangent, bring me back, ask me again.
Well, no, and I have to agree that was really, really important to include with people because, yeah, I have had a tendency to be all in or all out and such. And second half of life is certainly much more inclusive, is very much a both and way of being. But yeah, back to kind of the point of this. So yeah, this is, again, to me, sounds like a nice alternative than the way that wasn't working. And I certainly want life to be working in a way that, it doesn't mean it's easy, but it's easier. So again, what has been my daily practice is quiet time in the morning, doing prayer, meditation, and being mindful throughout the day. And this is something I believe every human being can benefit from, whether you are someone who appreciates the life and the teachings of Jesus, someone who even says there is no God. You're atheists, certainly. I know several atheists who practice mindfulness and meditation and, swear by it. So if anyone's listening right now and is curious about this, whether they've already begun the process and you could help them move forward, or they're totally new, like I once was and you showed me, could you talk with our friends a little bit about that?
Sure. I was just talking about this on Sunday, the Sunday message, using Brother Lawrence as kind of our poster child for exactly what you're talking about, this idea of an undivided presence that we can establish. He calls it practicing the presence of God, but it can be practicing the presence of everything all around us, and God becomes, the God of your understanding, however your understanding is some sort of higher power or universal presence. But the idea is that voice that talks to us in our head, that egoic consciousness, that mental activity, is really difficult not to associate and identify with as ourselves, as who we actually are. That's going to be the typical understanding of a child as a child gets into the age of reason and the voice kicks in and we're talking to ourselves and reasoning with ourselves and calculating and making distinctions and judging this and that in each moment and the contents of the moment, judging ourselves against others and others against ourselves. That's what the mind does, and it's a tool for survival. We need that mind. We need that egoic consciousness. It's our interface with the rest of the world, and it's also the means by which we do those four ways. It's how we operate and move from point A to point B in life. But if we identify with it, if we think that's who we are, then we're shelving ourselves off and making it impossible to make that transition into the second half of life. Typically, the second half of life is ushered in by some sort of trauma, tragedy, or great loss, an illness, anything that pulls the curtain aside on that illusion that the egoic consciousness is who we are. It's usually an outside force, and a very painful one. that strips away that illusion, at least for a moment, so we get the sense that there is another there out there. And then we can actually start to pursue it. And then how do we pursue it? Well, the way Brother Lawrence did, he found a way to continually question the thoughts that were in his mind. And this is what we can call meditation. We can call it mindful practice. We can call it a lot of different things. But every time he was aware that a thought in his head was not necessary to the duty at hand, the task at hand, the thing that he was doing at the moment, then he would work to reject it, to just step aside from it, let it fade into the background, and re-immerse himself in the task at hand. He got so good at this that it is said and his book can be highly recommended, even though he didn't actually write it as a book, but it contains conversations that were recorded by a friend of his and a eulogy and letters that he wrote and so on and so forth. But he's recorded as having said that he never thought beforehand or worried beforehand about a task that he was being assigned, because he knew that in the action, in the moment of doing the action, this sense of presence would be great enough to show him exactly what he needed to do. And when he left the task, he couldn't really tell you what he did. He was almost unaware of what he was doing while he was doing it, because he was so immersed undividedly in the present moment. And we need to think about this, because we can be aware of something without thinking about it. In fact, that's when we're going to be the most effective. That's when we're going to be the most content, is when we are so immersed in something that we're not actually thinking about it at the same time. Brother Lawrence made this an art form, and anyone who moves into contemplative practice is doing the same thing, getting to the point where you can be immersed in what you're doing to the point that you're not thinking about it. And then when he left it, he didn't really have any remembrance of it. They said when he left the dinner table, he couldn't tell you what he ate, because he was just immersed in the process itself. And so it's just fascinating. No worry before, no remembrance afterwards, just an undivided presence that we could call a continuous state of prayer. Well, that took him years, of course, to achieve and to master. And he talks about how difficult it was for him, how the thoughts were kept pummeling him. And anyone who's tried to meditate has gone through the same thing. Why go through the process and the hassle of trying to learn to set aside these thoughts? It's not so you can do it in the isolation of your quiet time room. It's so that you can get good enough at doing that in an ideal situation that you can then take it on the road. And then during the rough and tumble of your day, when you're getting triggered emotionally and when this and that is going on, you can still move back into that place where the only thought in your head is on the task at hand. And even better, when even that thought leaves and you're just automatically and in complete awareness and presence doing the thing that you're doing. When we live that life for a while, then we realize that that voice in our head is not who we are. It's a tool that we use to accomplish what we need to do in this life. And there is a deeper self that we can't really name or describe, because as soon as we do, we've stepped away from it. It just is who we are and can only be experienced in real time without the thinking, but the awareness, but without the thinking at the same time. It's a real interesting phenomenon that takes place, and it creates this shift in our consciousness and a shift in the way that we look at reality. And even as we continue to do the daily tasks of life, we do them with a different sense of perspective and clarity.
Yeah. Still working, still practicing this myself.
We're all practicing. I don't know if anybody gets all the way there. Maybe some monk in Nepal on the slopes of the Himalayas, right?
Yeah. Or maybe it's a dishwasher like Brother Lawrence. Maybe it's a dishwasher in the back of some restaurant here in Las Vegas who's able to get into this and such. But yeah, we do our best, and frankly, that has been one of my challenges. Again, as you allude, people trying to meditate, and you have an idea of what meditating is, and just totally getting all the noise out of your head so you're still and you're at peace, and there's nothing that ever comes into your mind while you're focusing on your breath or a mantra that you may have. I remember when you were teaching me, and such as like when those thoughts come in, you just don't hold on to them. It was, I believe you used the comparison of like a leaf floating on top of water on a stream, a river. It just kind of flows away. Yeah, there's the leaf, goes along. And we just don't cling to the ideas as much as we did before. And it's been a while since you taught me this and stuff. Maybe I've been totally down the wrong path. I mean, is that a tip for those that are meditating?
I think, you know, the main idea here, whether you're doing a following the breath technique, whether you're doing centering prayer, which incorporates a sacred word that you just kind of lay down gently in your consciousness when you realize the thoughts have crowded in again. The idea here is not to try to force the thoughts out of your mind again, whether they're actual thoughts in your mind or whether they're thoughts about something that's happening in your surroundings, a sound, a sensation, is that instead of trying to force them away, that's actually giving them more energy and giving them more thought. Now you're thinking about trying to make them gone. But the idea is to simply turn your attention away from them. And so if you return your attention to the breath, then all of that just kind of fades in the background. If you turn your attention to the sacred word for a moment, which is not a mantra, you're not going to be saying it constantly, you just kind of lay it down and then the thoughts dissipate once again. What we're trying not to do is to allow our attention or our focus to come to a point on any one thing. That's what we are defining as a thought, whatever it may be. The itch in your leg, if you start to define, put all your focus on that, it becomes a thought. Now you have been distracted and pulled away from pure presence and pulled away from where we're trying to practice going. And so you just allow it to dissipate. And so giving it less energy rather than more, and not focusing on another thing to stop focusing on this thing. There's some fine nuanced points here in terms of how to achieve this, but as you experience it, you will know the difference. But yes, it's along those lines, Randy.
Yeah. And frankness as such, not to turn this into a long lesson on contemplative prayer, meditation, and such. Dave's created some assets that I'll throw in the group and such. If this is something you want to dig a little deeper into, he's got some great assets to kickstart you going. We're going to kind of push you along as you've already begun. It's really
and
good.
I just want to point out that a lot of people will say that they are meditating and tend to be using the apps that are becoming ubiquitous, you know, on our smartphones, Headspace and Calm and other those, and those can be great tools. Typically what they do though is they also incorporate sound. They either incorporate a guided imagery, a person talking to you, or affirmations that are being said at the same time. Maybe there's music in the background or environmental sounds. And while that can be a good entree into becoming more adept at meditation, for our purposes, I'd like to just consider them training wheels on the bike that eventually are holding you back, and you want to take the training wheels off so you can really fly on your bike, right? And so to keep that voice talking to you is to keep your egoic mind active in a way that we are trying to let go of. So eventually, if you get more adept at doing this with the voice and with music, try removing the voice, and then eventually remove the music, and then remove the rain or the wind, and see if you can get down to pure silence and back your way into it. If you're too ADD to be able to sit quietly for 20 to 30 minutes in a single position, then try a walking meditation. Just having the body moving, even if it's just walking the perimeter of your room and just watching your feet, just take the next step, but going into that same space. At least that kinetic motion can help someone who just can't sit still for 20 or 30 minutes. And that's the goal, 20 or 30 minutes at a time, to be able to practice this on a regular basis. But I wanted to get that contrast because there is a difference between some of the ideas we have about meditation more popularly and the kind of contemplative meditation we're talking about here.
Yes, good point. So to kind of put a bow on this and tie this together, the contemplative way is also the fifth way. Is that understanding correct?
Yes, in a nutshell, we can consider it that, because it's always a relinquishing a moving in the opposite direction that we normally would move in life to acquire the things we want to acquire.
Right. So again, if someone was to say they're practicing the life of a disciple of the Christ, and they want to model as best they possibly can what Jesus demonstrated, which again, called the fifth way for simplicity and such, that would also be achieved by a contemplative practice. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and an understanding of the upside down nature of all of this, the inside out nature, that we're going to be powerful by being vulnerable. We're going to be strong by being weak. You know, that we need to embrace our sense of dependence and servant leadership and all those ideas that are so counterintuitive, especially for us as modern Westerners, to embrace that as you're moving forward in this contemplative practice. Is the key to, as I said, a modern Westerner to be able to sit at the feet of an ancient Eastern Jesus is going to need to go through that metamorphosis and that change in mindset and worldview.
Yeah, yeah. And in recovery, we call that contrary action. No, again, in the beginning for my self-sobriety, it's just like, hey, when you want to drink, no, don't drink. You want to call in sick to work? No, go into work. You don't want to go to the meetings. No, you go to the meetings. And if anybody is in recovery listening to this and such, usually you're glad you did. Kind of stuff. But for myself, this is a paradox, meaning it's unresolved, but there is something substantial to it, is strength and surrender. So when I was alluding to giving things up or giving things over, letting things go, or these ideas are not as important as they once were. They can still be important, but they don't need to be as important. I'm not clinging to them as tightly as they're. There's this weird thing that happens. I seem to have found a strength, a power, an energy that is greater than what was, well, again, my behavior is a pattern. I mean, again, am I surmising this correctly, Dave?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're hitting it right on the head, but it really does take a bit of mental gymnastics, before you can even act contrarily. You need to be able to at least have your thinking in the right ballpark, and so to be able to really realize our goal is the relinquishing rather than the acquiring. Now it helps us to be able to move. And then in each individual choice that we need to make during the day, then we can apply that contrary action you're talking about. But the awareness before the contrary action is the key. The two need to work together. We need to build our awareness to the point that we are aware in real time that we are making a choice here. And we can think beyond or transcend the triggers of the moment emotionally and the thoughts that are spinning in the moment, transcend that to be able to make the choice that's going to benefit the most people who are going to be affected by our decisions. And so the building of awareness is what's happening in contemplative practice. And that is the key, the prerequisite to being able to do any of the things that we're talking about doing. And so those materials that you alluded to is I did a series of 5 short videos, 5-minute videos that basically just give the why, the what, and the how of contemplative practice. What it is, why it's important, what are the benefits to you, and how does it work? And then those are backed up by 2 short ebooks, one that gives more definition and detail, and the other that actually gets into the techniques and the practices and some of the exercises that we can do. And so that's available, and you can give the links to your group that way.
And so it was said, so it was done. But yeah, I guess what I was trying to get to is, it may seem like, at least it did for me, that I was giving things up, and I really didn't know what was going to be replaced by that. And that's kind of scary. Again, I'll speak for myself. There was a lot of uncertainty going on. And what has come in its place is something really greater than I could have ever asked for or even imagined. and it's really hard for me to put into words. And honestly, again, I can share my story, how I've convinced that this is a better way to do life. Each of us has to do it for ourselves to understand. Again, this, what you use the word awareness, and to be aware that there is something greater than what the first of half life is. Again, all the, I don't know, the doing, the accomplishing, and having a state of being that has led me to do again, you taught me the paradigm of the ancient Hebrews and such, that they felt that they lacked nothing. They had everything they needed today, this moment. And there's a peace with that. There's a confidence with that. When that starts being embodied, and such, there's a much easier way for myself to go through life that has less of the regrets and the resentments that I had of yesterday, or the worries, concerns about tomorrow. If I can just be present today and such, there is that peace in the middle of the storm that I was talking about. But honestly, again, I've really struggled to try to describe this thing. For me, it's beyond words. And this is one of the things why I love Dave being involved with this discussion, because he does put it together in a way, well, he's been doing it a lot longer as well too, but he's able to express the unexpressible much better. And I hope some of you have had a little bit of this, a glimpse of this, enough to realize what we're talking about is substantial, and it's very, very realistic. It is this is not navel gazing type of stuff. This is the kind of thing that takes you into just a more efficient way of doing. So when, like with the group, when I talk about easier ways, I always like to say the disclaimer. I'm not trying to tell you that life is all going to be easy, but it's not as much of a grind as it once was. I think it might be the way to say it. We get into more of a flow state. And of course, if we're flowing instead of fighting, and it does get a little bit easier. That's been my story. Is that, again, that's my words. So would you say that's similar for you, Dave?
I like it. I like it. Yeah, once we have practiced this enough, it's going to get into that procedural memory, that muscle memory. We're literally creating a new normal for ourselves by rewiring our brain and letting the old patterns atrophy and bringing in new ones. And that's why this has to be acted out. Like you said, it can't be taught. You can't just read it in a book and get the concept and have that change anything. It has to be lived out, lived through, and over time. And practice like anything that really has value, from a second language to a sport, making music, whatever it is, all that has to be practiced out. It can't just be downloaded. And it's going to be the same thing with our spiritual life.
Yeah. And it's easier done in community too.
Well, ultimately, it needs a place to play out. I mean, why are we doing this if it's not for community and for relationship and for the sake of love and the beloved, right? So all of this is in the context of community, of course. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what I'm getting at is trying to set up the golf ball to, teeing it up to hit. And that is on Tuesday nights. You can zoom in. I'll put the links on that. There's a discussion. I'm just diving a little bit deeper. There's a dialogue instead of a monologue on Sunday of getting into things. And gee, go figure. Dave mentioned, Dave was talking about this on Sunday. And I'll put a link into that. You'll be able to see that in the group as well. Wednesday nights, book study night. Even though we're wrapping up, there are recordings of the book study of Falling Upward, that you can go back in time and see the discussions of the community. But let's do it in real time and such. So on Wednesday night, 6:30 p.m. Pacific time, you can join us. And yeah, we're wrapping things up, and I don't want to spoil anything for anyone and such. Well, you might be listening to this in the future and we're already ended in the next book. But as we wrap this up, hey, we're not going to stop the book study. We're going to go into another book. And it's going to be a very dynamic discussion. Dave reads from the book. He shares insights like you've just heard. But everybody in the group contributes. We're collaborating on creating a space, a community, with the common unity being what we've just talked about, the contemplative way. So thanks for listening. This again got kind of geeking out, going on a little bit longer. I never want these to be long discussions, but frankly, this is something that I'm very, very passionate about. And frankly, it has a lot to do with being involved with the effect community and what Dave shared with me. So thank you for sharing a little bit more today.
Thanks, Randy.
All right. Okay, friends, until we meet again, may peace be with you.